Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating article that asks a provocative question. Why is it that when our old beliefs start to crumble, so many brilliant thinkers who reject God also seem to walk away from spirituality altogether? So let's jump right into the big puzzle that the source text brings up. It's a story you've probably heard before. A really sharp analytical person realizes their religious beliefs just don't hold up anymore. But instead of looking for a new spiritual path, they often just walk away from the whole thing. Why does that happen so often? Now, for a lot of people, this is not some casual decision. It's driven by this really deep commitment to intellectual honesty. When the old arguments just feel hollow, your own sense of integrity practically screams at you to make a clean break. And what's usually the trigger for all this? Well, at the very heart of this crisis of faith is one of the oldest, and let's be honest, most painful questions in theology. If there's an all-good, all-powerful God, why is there so much raw, undeniable suffering in the world? So to make this feel a little less abstract, the author points to the story of the biblical scholar Bart Ehrman. His journey is a really powerful, real-world example of this exact intellectual and spiritual struggle. And the source here is really clear. Ehrman's journey away from his faith wasn't born from carelessness or laziness, but from the exact opposite, from being conscientious. He looked hard at the world's pain and just refused to accept easy answers that papered over what he saw as a fundamental contradiction. And that refusal is framed as an act of admirable integrity. And this right here is the core mystery the article tries to unpack. I mean, think about it. You've got traditions like Buddhism that don't even start with a creator God, so they don't have this problem of suffering to solve. So why don't they show up more often as a real live option on the table for these thinkers? Well, the argument presented here is that the answer isn't really about a lack of options. It's more about a very specific kind of cultural and academic training that creates, well, a pretty big blind spot. You see, in modern academic culture, there's this really powerful, unspoken bias. We're trained to put our trust in certain ways of knowing, things you can prove with textual analysis, with empirical data, with a logical argument. And that deeply shapes what we consider a respectable way to find truth. And this slide breaks down that difference perfectly. On one side, you've got analytic knowing. It's all about mastery, mastering data, mastering arguments. But on the other side, you've got embodied knowing, which is, well, it's totally different. It's about participation, direct experience, and a kind of insight that you just can't put in a footnote. So you can imagine, for a scholar who spent their whole career in that first box, the second one can feel, well, illegitimate. It can seem like mysticism, kind of squishy, unverifiable, and way too personal. It requires a kind of surrender that the analytic mind is trained to see as a weakness, not as a valid method. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, this is where we pivot to a completely different way of looking at the problem. The source points us toward Mahayana Buddhism, which doesn't try to solve the puzzle. It basically changes the game board entirely. This, right here, is the absolute key. The goal is no longer to come up with a defense for a good God in a suffering world. The goal is to investigate the very nature of the self that is experiencing that suffering in the first place. So here's how that pivot works, basically. You move from theodicy, that whole philosophical project of defending God's goodness, to a really practical investigation of your own mind. The path becomes about transforming your relationship to your pain, rather than explaining away why it exists. Now, you'll see these really complex frameworks like the Threefold truth here, and you might think they're just more abstract philosophy. But they're not. They're actually meant to be tools for practice. They're designed to help us directly experience how I and my suffering aren't these solid, fixed things, but are actually fluid processes, constantly arising and changing. Which, of course, brings us to the real core of this whole alternative path. It's not about winning a debate. It's about what happens when you actually sit down and engage in a practice. And it's really important to get this part right. This is not about turning off your brain. It's not anti-intellectual. Practice, whether it's meditation or chanting or something else, is described here as a way to restabilize your attention. It lets you have a direct intimacy with your own experience, an intimacy that our constant, chattering, conceptual minds often get in the way of. So the crucial question is, how do you know if any of this is actually working? The Buddhist teacher Nichiren had a term for it, actual proof. And it's not a philosophical proof you can write down. It's an experiential one. You test it in the laboratory of your own life. And what's so powerful about this idea, really powerful, is how practical and grounded it is. The goal isn't some magical fantasy where all pain disappears forever. The test is whether, over time, your internal relationship to that pain actually begins to shift. The proof is found by asking yourself some really honest, tangible questions, like, is your fuse just a little bit longer these days? Do you find yourself responding with compassion, maybe a little more quickly? Is that compulsive need to control everything? Is it relaxing, even just a little? That's your data, right there. So, what about that analytic mind we started with? The one that's so good at picking things apart. What does all this mean for the role of reason? Do we just throw it out? No, not at all. The key takeaway here isn't rejection, it's integration. The argument is that we actually honor our intellect the most when we understand its limits, when we don't demand that it solve existential questions that it just wasn't built to answer on its own. And make no mistake, that analytic mind, it does not vanish. It still has a vital, powerful role. Reason is what keeps us honest, it's what exposes cruelty, it helps us make sense of history, and it prunes our own traditions of their contradictions. It is an absolutely essential tool. But in this framework, the analytic mind learns a new posture, humility. It learns to bow. And in that small space cleared by that bow, that moment of not needing to have all the answers, something else, something the Source calls softer and more confident, can finally speak. And so the Source leaves us with this final, resonant question to chew on. It's an invitation to explore a different way of being. Maybe the goal isn't to find a perfect explanation for a world that weeps, but instead to discover that it's possible to move within that world with a little less loneliness and a little more trust.